So welcome everyone to another Behind the Theme. Today we'll be talking about Hammer the Scots again, with focus on the continuing quest of Robert the Bruce to become King of Scotland. So let's get into it. Last we left off, Robert had abandoned William Wallace, and with Wallace's defeat at Falkirk, the land of Scotland needed new guardians, and it was decided that the two most powerful / influential people would become the guardians. These two were of course John Comyn of the Comyn clan and Robert the Bruce of the Bruce clan. Now this all sounds good until you remember that the Comyns supported the Balliol claim of kingship, who was in exile, and still do. Thus of course the two men did not get along at all. In fact, there were many accounts of how much physical violence came up between the two. In fact, it got so bad that a third guardian had to be put in to try to keep the peace. This was the Bishop of St. Andrews, William Lamberton. Now this arrangement continued until 1301, when John Balliol was released from English custody, then to papal custody, and then from papal custody to French custody, by which basically it meant go home, because the French were at war with the English at this point. Now, when the news reached Scotland of Balliol's potential return, the Commons rallied behind the cause, out of course, practical reasons of literally being tied by marriage to the Balliol clan, and in my opinion, the true power behind the Balliol kingship in Scotland. Now, what about the Bruce? The Bruce, on the other hand, went to the English and officially joined Edward I's cause against Scottish independence. Now, there's of course practical reasons to this. The Bruce clan would never have a future under a Balliol kingship. This of course was practical, as many historians have pointed out, but the act of a patriot like William Wallace, I don't think so. Now, Balliol's return was being put into place with French support when the political climate changed drastically in the Battle of Courtrai. In this battle, 13,000 men from Flanders used the Schiltron, which is a formation used by Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk to deal with armored knights when an army has infantry. Think of it as basically a round phalanx. Now, with this French defeat, a weakened France then signed a treaty with England and even married a French princess, Isabel, to Edward II. And without French backing, John Balliol's return was put on hiatus, and sad to say, that hiatus will be forever, as John Balliol would never ever return to Scotland. Now, getting to the game, this is very well represented, as if John Balliol ever returns to Scotland in the game, he actually comes into the game with French knights, and these blocks are among some of the best units that the Scottish faction can have. And it's this kind of ability to play a what-if scenario that makes, to me, the best kind of historical war game. Now, getting back to the history, the entire closing of an entire war front allowed Edward I to turn his veteran army to deal with what he considered unfinished business, this being the North and Scotland. Now, Edward's veteran army handily defeated the Scottish army, which at a high estimate, the Scottish were outnumbered 5-1. Now, this is also the period where Edward I got a new war toy, which he aptly named Warwolf. Now, this was allegedly a huge trebuchet, which he used on Stirling Castle. It blasted the walls easily, but when the garrison asked to surrender, Edward basically told them that they had their chance before the siege, and continued to just bombard them out of spite, out of wanting to use his toy, whatever you call it, and basically took Stirling after he was satisfied. Now, on an interesting note, this is also the campaign that Edward earned his nickname Hammer the Scots. Now, getting back to the Bruce, what was he doing? Well, he was enjoying the fruits of allying with Edward I, and he actually became the Sheriff of Lanark, which, if you remember, is the Sheriff William Wallace killed to start off his rebellion in the epic poem called The Wallace. Now, in my opinion, this post is given to him somewhat mockingly, as it is way too coincidental. You have to take into consideration that at this point, Robert the Bruce is widely known as a traitor to Scotland. But of course, even though he had allied himself with the English, and the English had basically conquered Scotland once again, this did not stop our dear friend from wanting to be king. And thus, behind Edward I's back, he goes to deal with John Comyn. This is because he knows he can never get the crown as long as John Comyn is resistant. So he comes up with an idea. Now, what is his idea? He makes a compromise and tells John Comyn that whoever becomes king among them has to give the other clan all their lands. Now, whether John Comyn agreed to this or not, I could not find out. But afterwards, when Robert was in England, John Comyn was alleged to have betrayed Robert to Edward I. But Robert the Bruce was warned by the Earl of Gloucester by sending him a shilling and a spur, which basically represented the coin had the face of Edward I, meaning that Edward I was coming to get him and to get away using a horse by the representation of the spur. Now, both these stories, there's very little solid evidence, but it is part of the story. Now, in any case, Robert the Bruce gets back to Scotland and arranges a meeting with John Comyn. And at this point, distrust is so high among the two that they have to meet in a church out of safety concerns. That being said, even though the both of them were in a church, it was not long before physical violence broke out between the two, while the men waited outside. And in the end, there is no real or unbiased account to what happened, but Robert the Bruce basically kills John Comyn with a weapon. Of which you have to take into account that all the Comyns were said to have been told to give up their weapons. Now, the accounts we do have says that Robert the Bruce accidentally kills John Comyn, and that he stumbles out of the church and he's in shock and he says to one of his men, Kilpatrick, "I think I killed him." To which Kilpatrick said, "I'll go check." Now, in my opinion, it's way too coincidental that Robert the Bruce still had a weapon on him, that all of the Comyns were unarmed, and as a thorn in his side, he would never become king. Thus, with all these facts, I have to imagine that this was a planned assassination. But again, that is my opinion. Now, with this act though, Robert the Bruce now had a very, very bad problem, as he has killed someone in a church, which was sacrilege. With the act itself being done, there was not even a need for an announcement. It meant that he was instantly excommunicated. So now, on top of being excommunicated from the Church of Scotland and the church at large, he was also now known as a traitor to his native land. Now, this is an extreme low point in Robert the Bruce's quest for kingship, and if you were a betting man at the time, there was no way you would think that he could become king. But if there was something about Robert the Bruce, it was that he was persistent. He figures out that he needs to get forgiveness from the church, and he goes seeking out the Church of Scotland. And the thing you have to note is that he probably had a feeling for this, was that the Church of Scotland was amazingly patriotic to the cause of Scottish independence. Now, the Scottish Church, even though you must imagine being very troubled by this act, does a very utilitarian thing, as they saw that there was no choice left in the matter, as the last true legitimate perspective for kingship in Scotland was Robert the Bruce, and thus the Bishop of Glasgow gave Robert the Bruce absolution. Now, as we can see, the Church of Scotland has immense power. Now, in the game, this is represented by the positive effect that the church has for the Scots, as in winter, each area can only support a certain number of blocks or troops, but anywhere with a cathedral can support one more block, which in the game is quite a lot, especially if that block is at full strength, representing the fact that the Church of Scotland could gather men under the banner of whoever they supported. So in conclusion, another part of the story of the many turns and unfathomable situations that Robert the Bruce puts himself in and somehow manages to get out of. Next time, we'll continue with the rise of a king, death of a king, and the troubles of another king. So thank you very much. Subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. Thank you, and till next word.